Another day, another live here at Broadway Music Sessions. I am your host, Geraldine Anello. Another day of interviewing amazing Broadway professionals, music directors, and today, special show, we're having a Broadway copyist extraordinaire, Russ Anixter. Hi, Russ.
Hey, Geraldine. Hi, everybody.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm probably as anxious as everybody for life to start up again.
But
So
yet we're rocking the happy colors, you and me. We did not do this on purpose, but you're rocking the
no,
pink. I am rocking the red.
yeah. This is fuchsia.
Keeping up. I'm practicing my colors. What is this
Yeah,
color? I'm staying on
Oh,
trend over here.
peach.
Everyone,
Yeah.
if you are watching live, feel free to put your comments and your thoughts and questions for Russ in the comment section so I can ask them for you. So if you don't know Russ, when I say he's Broadway copyist extraordinaire, here are some of the many shows he's done. They include, and these are on Broadway, they include Oklahoma, King Kong, Summer, Frozen, Escape to Margaritaville, A Bronx Tale the Musical, Dr. Zhivago, It Should Have Been You, Bullets Over Broadway, Aladdin, The Nant, Cinderella, and the list goes on. I mean, you are a busy man, aren't you?
Well, when it rains, it pours,
When it rains,
which is the nature of our business. I could do another cliche, feast or famine. Usually when we have one show, we have two or three shows going on at the same time. I have a partner in my business named Don Rice, and we have a pretty good system down for supervising shows.
Now, yeah, so that's my question. How does one even enter that? I mean, you've been doing it since, I believe, 1992?
Yeah, I think so. When I got to New York, I came here to go to Manhattan School of Music. I have a degree in jazz and commercial composition. And I started working as a copyist while I was in graduate school. And in those days, it was all pen and ink on manuscript paper, which I'd love to talk more about.
We will.
Because it's, I'm kind of a champion of that process. But there were maybe 10 offices, very active, and they all had deep bullpens. And I remember my second year of graduate school, I made up a little sample sheet on, 10 stave manuscript paper. I just, with pen and ink, I made a sample of some things, and I took it around to all the offices. And I'm sure most of them ended up in the trash before I even hit the elevator. But I went into one office, and he actually sat down with me with a red pen and corrected things that he didn't like.
Oh my God.
And
that's
he
fun
said, "Go."
times.
No, it was wonderful. I mean,
let me show you everything you're doing wrong.
Yeah, well, I learned in California, and there's a different kind of style between LA. I was in San Francisco, but there was like a California style and a New York style. And my stuff looked like it came from California.
Wait. I have never heard of this before. And you and I have had many in-depth conversations about copying. Can you please give me the breakdown of what was different between the two coasts?
The biggest one was the stem length in the LA method, which I was kind of taught in San Francisco. The stem lengths were a sixth, the length of a sixth. And when I got to New York, the stem lengths were an octave. And that's a big difference right there. And, where do you put triplets?
So anyway, just to give my brain an idea and all our watchers, where is the current, now we're using technology, obviously, but what is the link of the technology? Has technology gone LA or has the technology gone New York?
Oh, it's probably closer to New York. I think the default is probably an octave, but you can control that you can control that anyway. You can make the stem length as long as you want it to be.
Right, but there's a standard, right? Like we all, it looks to me like they all look the same.
Yeah. But anyway, this one older copyist sat down with me. I'll never forget this. He sat down with me with a red pen, corrected my sample, and said, "Go home and do it again. Bring it back. If it, then I'll give you work."
And how much time did you have? Is it one of those where like it takes you a while to practice, or you can just go home, do it right once, you got it right away, you're good to go?
I probably could have gone home and done it and brought it back the next day, but I was still in graduate school and I kind of let it slide. And by happenstance, I showed up at his office. I was working for a company that's no longer in business called King Brand Music Products. They used to print the manuscript paper on big printing presses and custom score paper, and they sold pads of score paper to work with pencil and paper. And I had to go back to this gentleman's office to deliver something for King Brand, and I sat down. And I said, "You remember a couple months ago when I came in?" And he said, "Yeah." Oh, that's what I started working for King Brand. That's why I didn't go back and do that. But I said I would still like the chance to do that. And he says, "Anytime." So I did, and I worked for him for a little bit. And it was definitely like going to boot camp.
In what ways?
Well, did you ever see the movie The Karate Kid?
Yeah, well, I saw the second version, not the first.
It was like I felt like I was waxing his car and
Oh
and painting
man.
his fence and the whole thing. He gave me one assignment for Harry Belafonte, and it was easy. It was 12 measures of the orchestra playing, and then 12 measures of the whole orchestra singing. It was one of his simple tunes. And I'm looking at it, I'm getting the assignment in my head, and I'm thinking, oh, this will be easy. I can make one layout for the whole orchestra, put the vocals in with the lyrics, and then photocopy it off, and then go back in and fill in all the different parts. And this is all going in my head. And no sooner did I finish that thought in my head, and he said, "And I don't want you to do any layouts." And what I thought would take me an afternoon took me 3.5 days.
And now, why was that? Why the no layout rule?
Well, because he was, I had to do these lyrics by hand for every part in the orchestra over and over and over again. And by the time I was done, it looked really good. And, I just said, "Hey, did you ever see The Karate Kid?" And he nodded. And I said, "Well, I just waxed your car and, painted your fence." And he looked at me and he winked. He goes, "Yep."
That's a story
But it
for
helped,
the book.
it was like boot camp, and it really trained me. And, I wasn't one of the first computer copyists. Actually, Don Rice might have been one of the first. I know he has Finale version 1 on a floppy disk somewhere in a drawer. But I was probably, I resisted it at first. I didn't want to do it. I said, you can't do a Broadway show using Finale. And this is like 1992. And if you looked at the Finale manual back then and did everything the way they wanted you to do it, using their special part extraction thing, or I don't even remember the names of some of what they called things back then, you could not do a Broadway show.
Why? Wait, why? Why specifically?
Well,
what was missing?
Well, I think Finale back then was really designed for small projects. I mean, you had Macs that were, those Mac SEs or whatever that had the screens that were that big. I mean, you couldn't even get a whole page on there. And the things, the machines cost, they had very little memory in them. And I remember I had to do a data check on something to transform fonts from one to the other. And I submitted the data check and it started working. And I went to Central Park and played a game of softball and came back and it was still working. I mean, it wasn't meant for these big jobs that we have to do for Broadway shows. But Don and I both worked for Peter Miller Music Service, and he actually did the first Broadway show in Finale, which was Grand Hotel.
Which one? Grand Hotel. Wow.
Grand Hotel.
Live and learn.
Grand Hotel. I did not work on that. I started working for Peter a couple years later. I don't even remember. I think Don might have worked on that. But they came up with a methodology to be able to do a Broadway show that was outside the box of the finale manual.
Mm-hmm.
And, back then we created a separate document for every part as opposed to a score and then have finale do whatever it was going to do to your part.
Mm-hmm. So now, I mean, you
So-
brushed upon like that transition, but I'm curious, when you were a
Yeah.
grad student in jazz, was the goal
Yeah.
to be a full-time musician, or as soon as you got involved with copying for
Yeah.
money, you were like, wait, this is really cool. It's totally where I live. Like, at what
Well,
point did it become a choice rather than just a side thing?
Well, I started late in music. I mean, I played trombone and tuba and probably all the brass instruments one way or another, except French horn, in high school. But I didn't set out to be a music major. I changed as an undergraduate about halfway through. In fact, I added music as a second major. My undergraduate degree is actually in labor relations.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in college, I took arranging lessons outside of school for an ex-big band arranger, like I'm talking from the 40s. And this was the 1970s, late 70s. So he was probably in his 70s, and he had worked in the 40s as a arranger for the big bands. And he was trying to start a 10-piece band in this little town where I went to college. And he was offering arranging lessons if you would write for this band. And my first lesson was taking home one of his scores and copying the parts.
It was destiny.
Well, I did a terrible, terrible job. It was, I don't remember if I did it in pencil or a flare pen, which was the predecessor. I don't even know if they have those anymore.
I don't even know what it is. What's a flare pen?
I don't know. It was like a Sharpie. It's like a Sharpie now. Okay. And it was terrible. I had page turns in the middle of saxophone solis. I just did not know what I was doing. And he said, Russ, you're a trombone player. He says, you've seen what parts look like. And he pulled out for all you people that played in big bands, he pulled out a Sammy Nestico chart and he pulled out the trombone part. And it was all, anybody that's played in a big band has seen those old hand parts. And and I just like, you mean somebody went to work and did this as a job? He says, yes, they're called music copyists. And I was probably 20 or 21, and I was an okay trombone player, but not, like I said, I started late and I didn't really know what it would take. I didn't know how to practice until I got to college anyway, I knew that I wasn't going to be a trombone player. I thought maybe I could be an arranger, but I knew I could be a copyist. I said, I think that's something I could do. And I bought the Clinton Romer book. And I sat down and I taught myself how to do it, kind of rudimentary. I got taught better later. But, I would do all of my school assignments in pen and ink, late at night, watching TV, a little portable TV on the desk next to me, just kind of helps me focus, keeps me this way. But, and I started getting little copy jobs around my college, from, people doing their big band charts or brass quintets. And I just practiced that way. And I graduated, I moved back to San Francisco, and I wanted to get a job with the San Francisco Symphony in administration with my double major. I thought it would help me in like orchestra management. And I remember I had an informational interview with not the executive director of the San Francisco Symphony, but the woman that was like the number 2 person there. I think she went on to become the executive director of the New York Phil. But, she told me if you want to work for a big orchestra, you're going to have to volunteer. And I couldn't do that. My father was like, you got to get a job. You're 23, you're not volunteering. But anyway, this woman asked me, what else did I like to do? And I said, well, I like to arrange things, and I like to, I thought about being a music copyist. And she says, oh, you should meet Don Onoveros. He's one of our librarians downstairs. And I can't make this story. I couldn't make this story up if I tried. I went home and I called and I left a voicemail on the message machine for the San Francisco Symphony Library. And I was calling all week and nobody was calling me back. In the meantime, I had gotten a moving violation in Northern California where I was just finishing college, and I got to go to traffic school to expunge the ticket. And I was wearing a T-shirt that said Chico Jazz Festival on it. And we're taking a break during traffic school, and this guy comes up to me, and he goes, "Do you play?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a trombone player, but my main interest is arranging, and I'm thinking of being a music copyist." Thinking this guy's not going to know what it is. He goes, "Oh, I used to be an arranger and copyist in Los Angeles." I mean, what were the chances of that in traffic school during a break? And he says, "Right now, I'm one of the librarians for the San Francisco Symphony."
Oh, man.
I said, "Are you Don? I've been calling you all week." And he said, "Oh, you must be Russ." He goes, "Come down to the library on Monday.
What?
And bring some of your work." And I did. And he says, "You're a natural at this, but you need some training." So he gave me the phone numbers of two copyists in San Francisco, a guy named Tony Kay and another guy named Bob Harrell. And he said, "But don't call Tony because he's left-handed. He'll mess you up."
Oh, man, discrimination at its finest.
No, because the left hand
No, I'm
drags,
teasing.
right,
I'm
it drags
teasing.
across
I get
the edge.
it.
But I'll tell you, Tony Kay and Wally Dunbar in New York, two most beautiful hands I've ever seen, and they're both lefties. But they couldn't teach me, because it's different.
Right.
But these two guys taught me, and I did that,
It was
kind of part-time
destiny.
in San Francisco. It was. And I had a day job in San Francisco for a while, and I played trombone in big bands on weekends and at night, and I copied whenever I could. And
That's an amazing
I
story.
was in
I have a couple questions that I'd love to
Sure.
ask.
Yeah.
We've got one from Darren who wants to know, when you get the original files from the composers or from anyone, how much change do you make to make the final Broadway score?
Well, it depends. If we get the score by hand, that's, like Danny Trube or Chris Yankee, give me hand scores, that's probably not answering this question. That's a separate thing. But if somebody like Doug Besterman gives us a finale file with the score in it, we don't have to change much. Doug, we've been working with Doug for a long time, and Don Rice and Doug over the years have spent a lot of time refining templates and whatnot. So, we'll do score layouts for these orchestrators. They'll, fill in the notes and send it back to us. And if it's an orchestrator that we've had like a good history with, we don't have to do too much. Mm-hmm. If they're giving us a concert score, then maybe in the transposed parts, we might have to make some decisions about accidentals. But beyond that, we don't have to do too much. If it's a new client, that's another story. We might have to, change some things. But
do some education.
It's mostly appearance. It's mostly like fonts and we won't change their music, obviously, but, if it's a descriptive thing, we might change the font to make it look the way we want it to look.
Here's a question from Kevin. Can you briefly describe your taping process for parts and which tape you use?
I mean, we use artist tape, white artist tape. There's no real process. If it's an odd page going to an even page, the tape goes on the front. If it's an even page to an odd page,
that's what we call a process. If that's a not process, I don't know what a process is.
I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, I know some of these symphony libraries have these machines where, you put two pieces of paper in and you turn a crank and the tape gets pre-measured out.
Really?
But yeah, I mean, they're there. The one in the San Francisco Symphony Library has like 3 or 4 different, you can choose which tape you want,
High tech. So I personally, everyone, if you have questions, put them in the comments. But I want to go back to your story about the transition from hand copying to technology. So you mentioned Grand Hotel.
You have people, you have people like Emily and Jason talking about computer stuff, and they're doing a great job. I want to talk about.
I'm curious about the history. I'm curious about, you mentioned Grand Hotel is the first one that was done on Finale. So once that first one happens, does it kind of immediately, does the whole field change? And everyone from that point on is like, that's the way to do it? Or does it take 5 years, 10 years to slowly transition where there's a little bit of both happening concurrently?
I think it took about 5 years, maybe a little longer, to completely transition. There were big fights about it at first. I mean, there were like meetings and arguments and almost knockdown brawls about, should the rates be the same?
So what happened?
Well, some of the old time hand copyists back then, and none of them are still with us. They thought that the computer copyists should be charging more. And, then, I mean, ultimately there was no difference. The rates are the same, but, there was a lot of resistance. A lot of the older copyists back then felt threatened. Some of them never made the change. I mean, I remember being a computer copyist working on shows, and then I still get called in to do film work for Emil Charlap, and we would all use pens for that. And back then, that was probably the best way to do it anyway. Scores were being delivered at 6 a.m. for a 12 o'clock recording session. And, the scores were done by hand. I mean, it's not like you could look at it and set up a template and then start passing out things. And, it was better here, make 4 photocopies of the score, and you do the woodwinds and you do the brass and, get it out the door. I mean, I couldn't think of a way back then to have done it on computer.
I mean, it's so interesting because so much of the development part of a show is, there are copyists, and these days are music assistants that are there to keep track of changes in the room. But it's, you keep track of a change. Oh, this 8th note is now a half note. You just changed that. But I guess, how did that impact the development of shows back then? Were people more reticent to making changes because of the logistics behind it?
Well, you just made them. I mean, you had more time back then, and not much more time, but it used to be, at least, look, I haven't done a lot of Broadway shows by hand from start to finish. I would get called on when they needed extra work, so I'd work a couple days here and there on a show. So I didn't really do a show by hand from start to finish. But even when we started doing, shows, when I started working for Peter Miller, and we would, I would be on a show from start to finish on computer, you would have 6 weeks from the first orchestra rehearsal, from the first cast rehearsal to the first orchestra rehearsal. And now you're lucky if you get a month. Mm-hmm. So they would release things a little slower back then. The first week of cast rehearsal, nothing would come to the copyists. They're still figuring out, their choreography and dance arrangements and, settling on keys. So you wouldn't get anything for the first week and a half. And so then maybe you'd have 4 weeks or 3.5 weeks to copy a show, and you'd have, 6, 7 copyists working on every show. So the computer didn't really compress it. I mean, other elements compressed it, but now you're lucky if you get a month by the time the cast rehearses to the first orchestra rehearsal, and that first week of not giving anything to the copyist hasn't gone away. So now you're lucky if you get 2.5 weeks to copy a show, or at least to get, to the first orchestra rehearsal, getting the main numbers. But back then you had a little bit more time. I mean, there was still a lot of work to do, but you had more people doing it.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Rob, who wants to know, which music font are you using in finale for Broadway parts?
Mostly Petrucci.
And Darren wants to know, who owns the finale files? Would the MD ever get sent the finale files?
Well, on Broadway and only on Broadway, the producers own the finale files.
How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, those, I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, you know, when you're working now with, like, you know, a music director creating the piano vocals with an assistant, and we're involved, and over half of the orchestrators are using, you know, mostly finale, occasionally Sibelius. You know, it's a shared environment, you know, so the methodology makes sense. So, you know, you want to be a team player and share. Giving up the files at the end, I mean, they don't really, you know, they're not really that useful to somebody that doesn't know what they're doing with them. You know, I don't love the idea of it, but it is what it is. If it's not a Broadway show, we own the files. So if it's an off-Broadway show or a show in development, you know, we own them, and we might be a little bit more, you know, tightly controlled with them. Like the final versions with all the parts might go in a Dropbox that only the copyists have access to. And if somebody needs to do a revision, we might parse it out as needed. But
if you're given, excuse me, what did you say?
no, I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It does. If your next Broadway show gives you the option of doing hand copying the entire thing, or computer copying, or a mix of both, which one would you do?
Yeah.
And why?
Well, I couldn't do it. It couldn't be done by hand anymore. There aren't enough people that know how to do it. You know, I feel fortunate that I'm of a age that I got to experience some of that. But I might be one of the youngest people that knows how to do that. And I'm not that young. So I don't know that. Let me give you an example. And this was 2007. So this is already, how many years ago is that? 12, 13 years ago. My math isn't good when it comes to calendar years.
My math isn't good, period.
Radio City Christmas. Okay. That's another one of our big jobs. And there was a big number, one of the big numbers in the show. And it got put in, and there was one section in the middle that the music director didn't like. It needed to be big, and it had been orchestrated small. So he came to me, he says, if the orchestrator goes home tonight and brings you 16 bars, a hand score, do you think you can have a team here to put patches by hand on top of computer parts so that we could read it by the end of the day? And I said, I think so, yeah. And I was 48 at the time, and I had somebody 10 years older than me and somebody 19 years older than me. And, you know, that was all I could find that could do that. And the orchestrator didn't bring in 16 bars. He brought in 48 bars.
It would have been too easy.
And that's a 35-piece orchestra. So
oh, man.
Three of us, and I had my proofreader at the end of the table proofing it and then cutting and taping in on top the patches. And we didn't get it done. We had to, you said, you're going to have to read it tomorrow morning. I mean, I couldn't have had 5 people come in there. I could only find, and that was, 10 or 12 years ago.
Wow.
So I don't think there's people with that skill set now that could do that, which is kind of sad. I mean, when I don't do this anymore, but I used to get people sending me samples all the time of their work and looking for work. And I'll happily look at anything. And if I liked the computer sample that they sent me of their work, my first question was, do you know how to do this by hand? And not too many people said yes. The transition, once the computer took over and more of the offices shifted to doing it by computer, for a while we still had to do revisions by hand.
Wow.
I mean, you look at Wicked, you can see a lot of, in the book, you can see a lot of my handwriting on some of the parts still. It just was not, that might have been the show where Don and I figured out, we were still working for Peter, but we kind of figured out a way to make patches on the computer. I mean, there were no linked score parts kind of thing back then. Every part was a separate file. And it was almost easier to take, like on Wicked, for example, Bill Brown's hand score, and just make a hand fix, cut it out, and tape it over. And some of those parts, I mean, they've been photocopied over and over, but you can still see the DNA of the hand stuff in there.
And I know you
now
mentioned. No, go ahead.
Now with linked scores and parts, I mean, we don't do any hand revisions anymore, unless like we're at a recording session and it just needs to go quickly. But
I know you mentioned the fights that happened during the transition from hand copying to computer copying. And you said one of the arguments was about rates. But what other arguments were caused by that transition? What were the arguments on both sides?
Well,
beyond rates.
Well, I don't think the players liked it.
Interesting.
At first. I mean, they were used to seeing one thing. And all of a sudden they had to look at something else. And we all tried to make our computer parts look as close to hand parts as we could back then. I mean, in fact, Peter Miller had Don Rice design a notehead font to use instead of Petrucci that was a little more user-friendly to the player. It had more of a hand shape to it. The players were kind of resistant back then. Now, 20 years later, the current group of players might have that same problem if they had to do a show, from the MTI library or something that was done by hand.
And Rob wants to know, how do you feel about handwritten fonts like Jazz and Golden Age?
Well, Don Rice developed Golden Age.
Whoa.
So I would give it a plug, except it's not really supported anymore. He stopped supporting it a while ago. The operating systems change, and as the operating systems change, you have to address it in the font set. I mean, he designed it when he was on the road on that Marvin Hamlish show, The Goodbye Girl. I mean, they were in Chicago for 7 weeks, and he developed the font in the hotel room at night. But times have changed, and he's had a couple kids, and I don't think he wanted to be bothered anymore supporting that font. So it kind of gone by the wayside. Jazz font, I don't like at all.
Why?
Have you seen piano chords on there? Unless it's gotten better, they all look like just a blob. I mean, it's just big and I mean, it's it looks like the real book from Berkeley, and I guess if you're doing lead sheets, it's fine. But no, I don't like that one.
Well, Russ, thank you so much.
Golden Age. We had talked about using Golden Age when we started Anixter Rice Music, and we had decided not to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing all your love, clearly so much love for hand copying and all the history that I think we don't really get to hear so often. So thank you for enlightening us, spending a little bit of your afternoon with us. And everyone, thank you for watching live. Next time, 8 hours. It'll be we'll set up the whole day. Thank you, Russ. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back next week for another Broadway music session. Bye.
All right. Bye.